This week, gender equality activist and writer Michael Kaufman, author of The Last Exit, talks about why he's focusing on fiction writing now.
Fiction has an amazing way of connecting us with other human beings, I think, with possibilities, which is strange because it's fiction, because it's not true.
Welcome to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley. Caroline's taking a break this week, but tune in next week and she'll be back with us. Our guest today is Michael Kaufman. Michael has worked for decades engaging men to support women's rights and positively transform the lives of men. He's the co-founder of the White Ribbon Campaign, the largest effort in the world of men working to end violence against women. Michael is the author of numerous nonfiction and fiction works, was awarded the Canadian Jewish Book Award for Fiction. His most recent nonfiction book is The Time Has Come, Why Men Must Join the Gender Equality Revolution in 2019. And his most recent novel, which we're talking about today, is The Last Exit, a Jen Liu mystery. His books and articles have been translated into 14 languages, and I believe I read somewhere that he's been to 50 countries with his activism. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Michael.
It is great to be with you. And you know, I should add, of course, those 14 translations, I've, of course, did them all myself, you know, in my spare time.
Right. So let's just start out. Have you been writing your whole life, your whole adult life at least?
I have been, and I was one of those lucky people before it was popular to have a teacher in grade 1 who said, Michael, you should write a book. And I wrote a little book, and she stuck it in the school library, and it gave me such a thrill. I think it planted a seed that someday I should be a writer. So a lot of my work over the years has been nonfiction on issues around gender equality, women's rights, changes in the lives of men. But I've also written fiction over the years. My first published novel came out about 20 years ago. And although that work has been more in the background, it's really been my great love. And so I'm thrilled now to see my first mystery coming out this year.
And are you really turning your full-time attention to fiction writing?
Pretty much, I would say. I'd say 90%. I still have a lot of volunteer commitments, a lot of people writing me and wanting to speak about issues around men supporting women's rights, and so those commitments are still there, and some talks on those issues. But more and more, I'm trying to just focus over the next few years on fiction writing.
Well, I'd like to ask you about your work with feminism, essentially. There aren't too many men who have put as much time and attention into this as you have. What do you think in your upbringing, in your history, caused you to do this?
I think there's several things that inspired me to work in support of women's rights and positive changes in men's lives. I think, first of all, growing up in a family with a loving, caring father and a loving, caring mom who both believe that my sisters and I have 4 sisters, maybe that's the key, should be treated equally, should all have careers. Those are my assumptions from when I was young. And certainly at university, now many years ago, the women I knew were inspired by what was then called the women's liberation movement. But basically, it's because it makes sense. I'm someone who believes in equality. I'm someone who believes in justice. I'm someone who believes that we should all be treated fairly and equally and have rights. And if half of us are denied rights, if half of us are paid less, are more subject to violence in the home, are denied control over our own bodies, just by a 50-50 chance at birth, to me, that's not right. Not the 50-50 chance at birth, but the denial of rights of relegating half of us to be second-class citizens. Now, things have definitely improved over my lifetime, over your lifetime, over our lifetimes, and we can celebrate those improvements. We're not where we were in terms of inequality 20, 30, 40 years ago. But when we look at the statistics, we still see those problems persisting. And right now, in the midst of COVID, we're seeing unequal impact on women and men. So, I think we should celebrate the progress that we've made collectively. We still have a ways to go. But Monica, there's another thing that has inspired me to change. It's not only women's courage and heroism and pushing for change. It's not only saying we all deserve equal rights, but it's also that I firmly believe that these changes will benefit men too. Now, that might sound strange because we come from a world where, you say, well, men get paid more, men have traditionally had access to, the more prestigious jobs and positions, on and on. But here's the strange thing that I've written about over the years. The very ways that we have defined manhood, you will be tough and strong and in control and not show too many emotions. Heck, at times you're not always even supposed to have emotions. These things have an incredible cost on men ourselves. And we know that by looking at other stats. Men die younger than women. Men are less likely to seek help from a doctor or a therapist. Men are more likely to be addicted to alcohol and other drugs. Men are more likely to be the casualties from opioids, and on and on. Men are more likely to be in prisons. Now, these very strange things, we live in a male-dominated society still, and yet there's various ways that men pay a price for that. Now, I don't blame women for those things. What I blame is a male-dominated society. And what that means is that men are going to benefit from a world of gender equality. And I can tell you where we're seeing that most dramatically right now, and where our listeners here today, many of them have experienced this, and that is we're living through an amazing transformation in the role of fathers. When my kids were young, this was ages ago now, if I couldn't do something at night because I was looking after, my son, people would say, "Oh, you're helping out tonight."
I know. That always bothered me. Oh, you're babysitting your kids.
Yes, you're babysitting. I love that one too. I mean, if anyone said that now to my son, he'd want to clobber them. He's saying, "I don't help out. I'm a father. I'm a parent." And yeah, it's hard work for men. Of course it is, being a parent. But it's also one of the best things that has ever happened to us. And so I think that that's a great example about how changes in women's lives, that is the women saying that I don't want to be both out there in the workforce and doing most of the housework and childcare, that demand on men to change actually brings positive changes in men's lives. So this is what really excites me, that not only can we support equality and women's rights because those are important and good for women, but I believe because ultimately those things are good for men as well.
You talk about the changes that have occurred in our lifetime, and sometimes having lived through it, you don't really see the progress that's been made. But my daughter, as an example, she started watching Mad Men, which I really liked, that show. She couldn't take it. She could not watch it because of the sexism that was, and of course it wasn't, part of that was as the characters grew, the women in that show became more powerful and really came into their own.
Yes.
But in the first season, it wasn't like that, and she just couldn't stand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
She couldn't stand it.
Isn't it? Yeah. And it is amazing when you see that, because, there is so much these days that we can despair about in our own lives, in our country, the world. But at the same time, I think we can also celebrate some of the really positive changes that have happened in our lifetimes, or for others, at least in their parents' lifetimes. And these are positive changes. It shows the human capacity to deal with adversity and to fight for and to win changes, to achieve changes in our lives that are for the good. And man, at a time like this, we've got to not only acknowledge that, but celebrate that.
I know. Sometimes it's easy to, especially with what's been going on the last few weeks, to think, oh my gosh, the world's just going, to H in a handbasket, and things have never been worse. And yet, historically, if you really look at it, things in many ways have never been better. There are more people on Earth today who are living in freedom and prosperity, and be able to be who they are without being condemned than ever, I think, in history. Yeah. But we have so far yet to go, and so much backlash against the progress that's been made.
Yeah, and that is such a disturbing thing. And I think that backlash comes from different things. It comes from, in some cases, those who don't want to give up forms of power and privilege in their own lives and want to turn back the clock. I think for others, there's fear. There's fear of change and what it might be. And unfortunately, there are those out there who've become really good at stoking up that fear, feeding into the fear, spreading misinformation that builds the fear. And so it's no surprise that there's resistance to change. I mean, change, let's face it, for any of us, change is difficult, even if we can say in the long run that it's going to be positive. To get to that point, it can be very, very hard. So, there is that backlash, and it's discouraging, and it's why we need our voices, and our voices, I think, have to be positive ones. We can't just focus on what we don't
not
like,
just,
and what we
not
disagree
just
with,
condemning
what we hate.
what's wrong.
Yeah,
but offering solutions and alternatives. And actually, fiction writing is one way to do this. I think sometimes fiction can convey a message and convince people, and this is true with movies and television too, in a way that other things cannot. And I'm wondering if that is part of why you are turning your attention to fiction writing now.
Interesting that you say that. I mean, partly, as a reader, I love reading fiction. I mean, for many years, it's been my staple. I love that it can bring me into another world, even if it's a present day world. It's a different experience. I love that feeling of being lost in a book. I love that feeling of transformation that you can get when you read certain stories. And I also love that there's ways that fiction can get us into a zone where we can be thinking about different issues or problems, possibilities in a way that we might not otherwise. And so, yes, I think fiction, we're not talking about fiction getting into, hammering people over the head with, little speeches about what things should be. That can get awfully boring. When you read a book that, okay, and now the message,
Yes, exactly.
But I think that into the texture of a good book, into the assumptions, into the words, into the conflicts and the issues that the characters are dealing with, it really can get us thinking in ways that maybe we don't resist as much, that we can just let ourselves go and follow the flow. We can have a character who, this isn't talking about this book, but you could have a character where he or she might have opinions or even do things that we might find offensive or reprehensible. But in a book of fiction, you get to know that person, and even though you don't ever agree with, let's say, that reprehensible thing they do, you can start feeling some empathy with them. Not sympathy for what they did, but some human connection. So fiction has an amazing way of connecting us with other human beings, I think, with possibilities, which is strange because it's fiction, because it's not true.
Exactly. You're listening to Writers' Voices, and our guest today is Michael Kaufman, author of The Last Exit, a Jen Liu mystery. Let's talk a little bit about what kind of book this is? It is a mystery, but it's also dystopian fiction and kind of political thriller, and what all have you got wrapped up in here?
I've been amused when I've seen just over it just came out, and already I'll go to different websites will have this is one of the top 10 thrillers you should read. This is one of the top science fiction stories you should read. This is one of the the police procedurals you should read this winter. And that's exactly what I want to hear, because it is a cross-genre book. On one level, it's a pretty much straight-ahead mystery, a police, what we call in the business, a police procedural. Something happens. There's a police officer that is trying to figure out who done it, or if, in this case, if there was something done, and then who done it. It's also set in the near future. It's set in Washington, D.C. in 2033, which is only, 12 years away from now. So pretty soon, from pretty, not too far away. So it is set in the future. So, but it's not, there are some dystopian elements. That's true. I mean, climate change is taking its toll, as it increasingly will be, sadly. There is another virus that has broken out. I want to say I wrote this I finished this in 2019 before COVID hit us. But there is another virus that is affecting people. And there's some other there are some other dystopian elements, but I did not want to write one of these grim dystopian books. Or we've read the books, we've seen the movies. There's drizzle and neon lights everywhere, and you just want to jump off a bridge by the end of seeing or reading it. I had no interest in that. I mean, partly because I'm an optimistic person. So I do know, and I feel, and I think that yes, there's going to continue to be real challenges in our future and things that will need to be changed. But at the same time, really optimistic about our capacity to create a better world and a better life for us all. So there are dystopian elements in this, but it's not one of these grim dystopian novels. I also want to write something that was really fun to read, and that was exciting, but also just plain fun. And partly I achieved that because half the book is narrated by the synthetic computer implant into the brain of my protagonist, my main figure, this Washington D.C. cop named Jen Liu, and she's part of this experimental program to have a computer implant, and this is something implanted into her brain that, and this implant, whose nickname is Chandler, actually narrates half the book. Now Chandler is this wannabe tough guy, but he's only a bit over 2 years old, so he has a hard time pulling off the tough guy routine. But he does have his own way of looking at the world and what's going on around him as this basically non-human observer. So it's a book, I wanted it to be, just a fun mystery for mystery lovers. I did want it, it has, because it's set in the future, it will also appeal to science fiction readers, but I also wanted it just to be a straight-ahead novel for those who don't necessarily pick up mysteries or science fiction. On another level, a straight-ahead novel that talks about personal change and personal heroism and transformation and what we can do with our lives.
Now, Jen is the detective, Jen Liu, and so she is, of course, female. But she does seem to be patterned somewhat after these crusty old male police detectives, particularly the ones that I love from Scandinavian fiction, like Harry Hole and
right.
Yeah, and there are aspects of her personality that are not all that likable.
Like what?
Well,
what struck you?
What
I'm
struck
curious.
me? Well, there's an explanation of why, but her attitude towards her mother, who was...
For example.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that can potentially make a book boring is if you have a protagonist who is perfect, who's
Yes.
just who just says everything right, is just it's just the superhero who's coming to the rescue. And I certainly want to avoid that. I also, because this is the first of a series of books, I wanted to make sure that my character, Jen Liu, could develop, could evolve. When I think of some series, including ones that I won't mention any ones, but there's some series that I love reading. But when you look at them, the character hasn't changed over the years. What you got in the first one 20 years ago is the same as what you get now, and they may be lovely, fun to read, but I want my characters, just like humans, I want my characters to change, to grow, to develop. Well, we do that when we have to, when we're confronted with issues, with problems, with challenges. And for my character, she's not the crusty old, she's not the stereotype. She's not into drinking. She's not, this or that. She's a bit of a fitness buff, actually, and a runner. But she certainly has her demons, and that you're absolutely right about that. And some of them come out in relation to her mother. Who at the stage, I'm not giving anything away here, at this stage has Alzheimer's, but has had a very tortured past with her mother. And so one of the challenges that she faces on a personal level in the last exit is some of the decisions she has to make in relation to her mother. Again, to me, it's that's what our life is. We have our jobs and we have things we do that may or may not be interesting or exciting. In Jen Liu's case, they happen to be because she's a detective in a mystery story. But we also have the quotidian, those everyday things that can be wrenching, that can be wonderful, and those things too are part of her life.
Now, the title, The Last Exit, do you want to explain that?
Sure. Well, here is the dystopian part of this world. This is a world of growing inequality, of rising unemployment because of ongoing technological changes and automation, and growing population as it inexorably does. So one of the things that the powers that be decided on in the late 1920s was pretty awful policy. Now, here's the thing. By this point, companies, some big pharma companies, have developed longevity treatments. And this is out of the news now. There's companies now that are spending millions and millions to try to develop drugs, treatments, concoctions that will let people live longer and longer and longer, who knows for how long. Well, they've done this. This is available to the ultra-rich. They've made it staggeringly expensive. The ultra-rich can live, well, if not forever, for pretty near that. Well, how do they deal? How do these policymakers in 2033 deal with rising population, impact of climate change, all this? They've developed an awful policy called exit, and that is if a parent agrees to voluntarily die when they're 65, their children get basically a modified version of this longevity treatment that will allow them to live in a healthy way and well into their 90s. And the reason why that's particularly important is this virus I mentioned that is clobbering a disproportionate number of young people in their middle-aged people in their 40s and 50s are actually dying in large numbers because of this untreatable virus. So parents, as parents will do, will say, okay, I'll do anything for the health, the well-being of my children, and are going along with this voluntary exit policy and dying young. Well, it's an awful thing. And at the very beginning, my detective hears rumors hears rumors of some sort of street version of this treatment. Here's rumors that maybe there's something in the black market, as it still gets called, that is about to provide this modified treatment at a low cost. She starts hearing that, starts wondering what that's about, and then some people start mysteriously dying, apparently from this street version of the treatment. So she's got to. She suspects there's something nasty afoot. She needs to track down who is behind this street version, what it is, what's happening, and why someone might be distributing something that could be killing people. So that's where it starts. And it's a mystery that involves big pharma, that involves some co-ops that are trying to provide, or maybe nefarious, maybe the good guys, we don't know, that provides various possible culprits and who's doing what. And in that sense, it becomes a pretty standard police procedural, tracking things down.
Well, one of the things that I found most disturbing was the idea that if a parent did not voluntarily exit and their child kills them, that isn't considered murder.
Yeah, there's one case of that, and it's particularly awful. Now, we're the way we're talking about this is starting to sound like a really grim book. And I just have to repeat, it is a fun read. Although there are some scenes that you wouldn't say this is a fun scene, but yeah, there's Jen Liu actually works for a police unit called the Elder Abuse Unit, and it both does some of the traditional things in the world of elder abuse, that is, young people abusing, or children, or adults, whatever, abusing older people, or pushing them to do this exit. But it also involves the opposite, that is, parents refusing to do their duty and quote exit. So yeah, it's a bizarre turned around world. And for me, part of the story is. Can you bring to an end policies like this? I mean, it's obviously that one, that bit is you can say, well, okay, that one's far-fetched. But there's things that start coming along that you start thinking, well, does it have to be that way? How could we change things? How could we construct policies that are going to be really helping people, rather than having humans make terrible decisions between their own well-being and that of their children. And that's the underlying theme and issue that's involved there.
You're listening to Writers' Voices, and our guest today is Michael Kaufman, author of The Last Exit, a Jen Liu mystery. Why don't you read to us from the opening of the book, Michael? Okay.
Well, this, I'll just say, is every other chapter is narrated by Chandler, this synthetic computer implant, and so chapter one is the first. It's narrated by Chandler. I won't try to do any special voice. July 3rd. It was only 8 a.m, but I could already feel sweat collecting under our breasts. Jen had been kicked in the butt for switching me off for 5 minutes while on duty last week. So, for the third day in a row, we were back in regulation blues, trudging along the 2-mile path circling the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. It was boring work. Retrieve phones dropped in the water. Search for kids who eluded their parents' jail guard gaze for 2 seconds. Tolerate the private U.S. Park Police. Help the dumber tourists figure out which one was the Jefferson Monument. Keep an eye out for the saltwater crocs. This task seemed a particular waste of time, since only one had been spotted so far this summer. But then again, it had eaten a jogger. When the croc was shot and sliced open, the running shoes still looked new. I was young, 2 years and 3 months. Detective Jen Liu was 38 and change. I'll be dead in 3 more years. She'll live to 100 after her mother does her duty and exits, and Jan can snag the treatment. Good for her. 8:03:52. The sun was smudged by haze that hung around like a fart under a blanket. We heard a shout by the FDR memorial, then a screamed. I tagged the time and our position. We ran. A Caucasian man who looked like he'd been stewed in scarlet food coloring was screaming at a black woman in yellow running gear. She was lying on her side, clutching her shoulder. I scanned the man and found a match. Watch out, I cautioned Jen. We ran harder. The man saw us and shot off like he had a Roman candle up his butt. We reached the prone woman, yelled, "You all right?" We got a nod and took off after the man. He was good. We were better. We tackled him at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. Nonviolence has its place, but I whacked him across the face. Jen said, "You didn't have to do that." Sure I did, and you know it. James O'Neill he was, 27, follows the Klan and 2 neo-Nazi sites, arrested once for battery. Dad is a timeless, so James got off. We cuffed him, and I called it in. We waited for the car, handed him over to me, sharing the data and timestamp with the officer's synth. We went back and called an ambulance for the jogger, although she said she was fine. Any hope we'd be rewarded with a better gig for the day crashed when I received the order to get back on patrol. Thursday, July 3rd, 8:42, Washington, D.C., good times.
That's one of Chandler's favorite phrases, isn't it? Good times.
Good times. Yeah. It is.
You know, we have time. You could read a little bit from Jen's point of view.
So this is chapter 2 from Jen's perspective, talking about meeting her boyfriend, Zach. Early in their relationship, Jen realized that Zach had many althoughs in his life. He had a moderately steady, although excruciatingly small income. He had a PhD in environmental economics from the London School of Economics, although that didn't mean he had a job. For the past 2 years, he had run a gardening business, although the word business was a bit of a stretch, since he worked from a bicycle that dragged a tiny trailer. In the winter, he shoveled snow, although snow in D.C. was now as rare as pregnant popes. And he had a nice place to live, although, like millions of others, it was at home with his parents, even though he was 41. He was expecting, although not hoping, that would come to an end in January. After all, his parents were both 64 and close to exiting. If Jen had first seen him in close-up photographs of his face, she wouldn't have tagged him for a fashion model. His eyes were slightly too far apart, and his head was one size too large, as if that big brain of his had pressed everything outward at some point. He had a boyish mop of hair that was forever flopping into his eyes, and by contrast, a long-ago broken nose. But in some unaccountable way, snap all the pieces together and add in his strong shoulders, and they gave him a rugged yet vulnerable appeal. Jennifer found him remarkably good-looking. No, more than that, she was mesmerized by his looks. They'd met a year earlier after an accident she had on the trail along the Potomac. Afterwards, she had phoned her best friend and her work partner, Les. She said, his hairline is so low, I think he's part Neanderthal. Yuck, Les had said. Did you hurt yourself? Caught a piece of glass, nothing serious. You're still wearing those stupid minimalist shoes? Jen didn't respond. And he rescued you. You don't have to say it like I was a damsel in distress. Did he? Well, kind of. He was riding his bike and saw me fall. He stopped and asked if I was okay. I said it was fine. He got off his bike about 10 feet away and had a sip of water. But it was obvious he was making sure I wasn't going to die. I repeated, I'm fine, to try to get him to scram. I examined the bottom of my shoe. There was a nasty shard of glass sticking through the rubber. Through the thin rubber, said Les. Glass had somehow dug through the extremely tough rubber. I pulled it out, started to stand, but, well, he pulled out a first aid kit, came over to me and said, let's have a look. I asked if he was a doctor, and he laughed. I wriggled out of my shoe, and there was blood everywhere. He said, you tested? Just like it was an everyday question. And when I said I was fine, he replied, okay then, let's have a look. He cupped my foot in his one hand. Did I tell you he has nice hands? Les said, nice hands are definitely a turn-on, and carefully wiped off the blood with a piece of gauze. The cut was on the ball of my foot, near my toes. He peered at it. He wiggled the 2 closest toes and looked at me. I shook my head, saying it didn't hurt. He said, "Scream if it does." He pressed gently around the perimeter of the wound, checking for another piece inside. At each point, he glanced up at my face. Halfway around, I swore, and he suggested we go to the hospital. "Les, do you really want to hear all this?" "Yeah, why not?" At first, I tried to walk, and he pushed his bike alongside. But it hurt like hell, so he said, "Why don't you borrow my bike?" It wasn't fancy, but I could tell it had decent parts, and I said, "What if I steal it?" Les said, "You tell him you're a cop?" "Nope," he said. "Well, you wouldn't take it, would you?" It wasn't a question or a command, like he'd known me forever and trusted me. But the bike didn't have real pedals, just those clip-on knobs like I knew would kill my foot. So he said, "Well, then hop on." I pulled myself up side saddle on his bike frame, and off we went. Les said, "Are you nuts? You took off with a total stranger?" Well, he didn't give me any sketchy vibes. Classic psychopath. I'm not an idiot. There was nothing creepy, totally the opposite, and anyway, I knew I could handle it. "Okay," Les's voice was tentative, but he always was a sucker for a good love story. I was trying to hold myself upright so I wouldn't touch him. I mean, I trusted him, but I didn't know this guy from Adam, and I was soaked from my run. So this happened about 3 miles out, so he had his arms around me, holding the handlebar, and he has beautiful shoulders, and I guess I sort of let myself lean against him little by little, and before long I just about had my head against him, and he was telling me about how much he loved it out there, and I was saying I used to escape there when I was a kid. Before I know it, he said, "We're here," and I barely noticed we'd come back into the city.
And that was Michael Kaufman reading from The Last Exit. By the way, you're a wonderful reader.
Thank you.
But obviously, you know these characters. You know what they would sound like.
I do. Although you know what, can't wait to hear the audio book is should be coming out any day now, and they've actually hired 2 voice actors to do the reading. A male to do the Chandler parts, and a woman to do the other parts, like the one I just read. So I can't wait to hear professional actors reading this. They're the ones who'll be good.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Now, did you have any difficulty getting the book published?
Well, luckily I have a wonderful agent, and they're the ones who did the work. So it's quite a process. I think a lot of readers don't. Well, there's no reason to know that all that goes into this selling and publishing process. You know, I think it used to be that authors would send a book to a publisher and with luck get published. Now there's often a long process of trying to find an agent. Luckily, I already had one for my other writing, and then you work with the agent to they give you feedback on the book, and when it's in a shape that they're happy with and you're happy with, then they say they take it out, as they put it, and they send it around to different publishers, and we were lucky that right away we found one that both I thought would do a really good job with the book, and we're so excited by the book. And it was interesting because usually once the book is acquired by a publisher, it takes a year for it to come out. That's just what you have to go through for editing and cover design and publicity and printing and all this stuff.
At a minimum.
They wanted to, at a minimum, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, this was last January, and they wanted to rush it into print for the beginning of September, this past September. So that showed their excitement with the book. COVID hit, and publishing schedules got changed, so it's just come out at the beginning of January. But I'm really excited by what Crooked Lane has done with it, and I love the cover. I can look at the different books I've written on my shelf, and some have good covers, some have not so good covers. But when I saw their cover for The Last Exit, I was just so excited. So yeah, the process has gone really well, and I was so blessed because a number of really top authors, both mystery and some non-mystery writers like Emma Donoghue, have written blurbs, those things you read on the back cover, and so I just felt so much gratitude that they did that for for an unknown mystery writer, and so it's an exciting process.
Emma Donoghue is the author of Room, for those who aren't familiar, and she wrote about your book, an engrossing thriller set in a fascinatingly plausible near future. The Last Exit centers on a human-AI partnership that's as believable as it's moving. So this idea of having this AI chip implanted in the brain doesn't seem that far-fetched, but to have it have so much personality, and to have the story told partially from his point of view, where'd you come up with that idea?
Who knows? Part of the book evolved out of a conversation that I had with a friend in D.C. We had written a book about 6 years together, a novel together called The Afghan Vampires Book Club. It's an anti-war fable, essentially. It's not a vampire story, but it's an anti-war fable. And we were walking. He said, "I have an idea for a book," and it. He started talking about this idea, near future. That was the same, and he said, and a virus, and we started talking about some sort of surveillance issues. Anyway, we were just, as we took this long meandering walk, and in the weeks that followed, we were just throwing ideas back and forth. In the end, he's gone off. He's writing a literary novel that goes off in a totally different direction than I totally went off on. But some of it just came out of a conversation on surveillance issues, this idea of starting with police wearing body cams and how that might further evolve. But as we know, there are those who are in different ways working hard to develop different types of implants. I mean, a friend of mine has an implant in his brain because he has Parkinson's. It's a computer in his brain that regulates certain brain functions to help with his Parkinson's symptoms.
And does it help? Is it helping?
It does. It's
Wow.
extraordinary.
Wow.
It's extraordinary how it works. He's not back to how he was before, but it dramatically changes the symptoms. There's just reading about other implants that possibly could help those who've had spinal cord injuries. I mean, on and on. So part of the idea of having implants isn't as far-fetched. I mean, this is, I would say, 12 years from now they won't be as advanced as this. I mean, this is fiction, but it's also, as you'll see, when we talk over the next year, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years as the series goes on, it also deals with the issues of whether things like this are ultimately good or bad, or maybe neither good or bad, but are just complicated. Chandler himself, one of the things that surprised me as I wrote it is how Chandler, this synthetic implant, develops as a character. One of the things that just, that pleased me, both when I heard from my agents and then the publisher and now readers, one of the first things they say is, "I love Chandler's voice."
Yes,
he was
yes.
so much fun. He was, he had just had a great narrative voice, and so he is a real character. But here's what I did not imagine for a second, that his character would evolve and change even in the course of this one book. As I was saying earlier, we expect our protagonists, we hope that our protagonists will go through changes in the book, will develop as characters. And in good books, they do. But I wasn't thinking about Chandler that way. And one of the things that just caught me off guard was the way he starts changing, he starts evolving, and that will continue through this series of books. which makes me really excited because it means that I've got, in a way, two protagonists who are interacting at the most intimate level, in the level of her brain, and yet changing and going off in slightly different directions. So it's both sort of creepy and interesting and disturbing and fun and challenging all at once. I wanted to, as I say, I want to write a book that was fun but also made you think.
And also deals with some pretty serious themes, like you mentioned, surveillance and artificial intelligence, climate change, also racism.
Yeah.
And what are some of the, how is that dealt with in the book?
Well, one of the things that's part of the backstory of the book is that I have a fictitious uprising, or a protest. Uprising would be the wrong word, but protests in D.C. in the mid-20s by Washington police and civil rights organizations and women's groups against police brutality, focused on, on some of the issues that the Black Lives Matter movement has focused on. And again, this, I'm hoping that people don't think that somehow this was hastily written over the past year. This was written, well over a year ago. I wanted to get into these issues of both the realities of racism, but also as I was saying before, our capacity as people to organize in positive ways to bring about change. So I didn't want to just talk about the problem of racism. I want to talk about people organizing for change. In this case, and in the book, there's a backstory about a group of officers who ended up being arrested and disciplined for supporting this positive movement against police brutality. And eventually, there was such huge protests across the country in support of them that those officers not only were released, but it led to, in the story, massive reforms in the D.C. Police Department and in some other departments. So again, I want to have a positive story about change. But
do you think that could actually happen? That we could actually I know that there are good policemen out there who are as appalled at the brutality as anyone. Could they make a difference?
I think it's a really good question and not an easy question. During the Black Lives Matter protests, in a few places we did see police officers taking a knee and going out not to talk at but listen to the protesters. They were isolated cases, as we know. We're dealing with a big structural problem. We have police departments now across the country that have been heavily militarized over the past couple of decades, and just have been turned into paramilitary forces with weapons, like tear gases and things that we don't even use in war anymore. So heavily militarized. We also have this issue of, this so-called thin blue line. I've actually, for my gender equality work, I've worked with police officers. I've gone into police departments and done training. I've worked with officers, and often, outside of of a workshop or a discussion, individual men or women or both will come to me and say, I want to be able to speak out. I want to be able to speak out against, when I see injustice in the ranks, when I see racism in the ranks, or sexism, or occasionally even corruption, and they just say very honestly, I'm too scared to do it. And I see this police officer, and I'm going, if you're scared to do it, what hope is there for the rest of us? But what they're scared of is they're scared of retribution,
yes.
So-called parking lot justice. They're scared of not being promoted. They're scared of being ostracized. They're scared of making police look bad, and they don't want to do that. So I think it is going to take all those officers who don't like seeing police officers turned into paramilitary troops, or don't like seeing those acts of individual or collective racism, who don't like seeing police break up legal protests or strikes, for that matter, workers' strikes, who are going to say, okay, enough is enough. We can't just go along with stuff because others are doing it. And it's a very difficult thing because officers, their job is to follow orders, and they're trained to do that. And so it becomes very, very difficult for individual officers to make a difference. So, that does get into a big, big question. I hope and that more and more will have the courage to step forward and to speak out and to stand up to their fellow officers. I know from hearing from so many how difficult that can be, and I just hope that we'll see more and more of that.
Now, in the last exit, you mentioned, or you're starting to say that even though there was this protest against racism, and the problem didn't go away.
Yeah, I mean, it's we're dealing with a centuries-old problem, a problem that's actually, when we think about the U.S., at the very foundation of the U.S. in so many ways, and ways that I think those of us, I'm a white person, and those of us who have lived a life where we haven't had to be confronted with those certain realities have got to do some hard listening and hard thinking. It's not to induce collective guilt or collective blame, but it's to induce some collective understanding and compassion and willingness to be part of a process of change. And of course, the change is so deeply embedded, it doesn't change overnight. And so Jen Liu, as you can hear from her name, is a Chinese American woman. She's experienced racism in her life. You heard in that excerpt I read in the first chapter, there's a character who attacks a black woman, and this character we see has had a neo-Nazi past. So it's I don't think any of us are imagining, and particularly not these days, that problems of racism or far-right organizing are somehow going to instantly disappear or even disappear in the short term. But I truly hope that as more and more people look into their hearts and speak out and find ways to join up with others, including others they don't agree with, and find common cause to speak with one voice against injustice, against racism, for greater equality, against the growing economic inequality in our society. As we find more ways to join together and to as I say, to work with those we don't fully agree with, I think we can begin to reduce these horrible problems, including ultimately end the legacy of racism.
So, Michael, let's go back a little bit to writing, and
yes.
in writing this book. Although I'm really glad that we are talking about some of these issues, but I'm curious, when you set out to write The Last Exit, you had this concept, but a mystery, a thriller, these types of books are heavily plot reliant. Yeah. How much did you know about what the story was before you started writing?
There in the world of mysteries, there are those who plot out every move before they start typing, and there's those who work by the seat of their pants,
and
just
plotters
let
and
it
the
unfold. The plotters and the seaters. And I would say, I don't know if I'm allowed to create a new category. I'm an in-betweener. I had the general run of the story. I actually hadn't fully. I was pretty sure I knew who done it, but I wasn't completely convinced. I had a possibility of a different of a different stream opening up. And it did, as I worked, it became pretty clear to me where the plot had to go. So what I would keep doing is going back and changing my somewhat sketchy outline and new iterations of an outline. So I had an outline, but I kept changing the outline. I knew some of the things that were going to happen, and some things are just the beautiful serendipity of writing. I'd be out on a run, and it's this magic thing. I'm out on a run, and I'm hearing a conversation between two of my characters. And, it's just like dialogue going back and forth. And suddenly, I'm not only imagining my characters in a more vivid way than I had before, but suddenly they're doing something or saying something that I hadn't expected. And we, as writers, we have that slang, my writers, take on a life of their own. But what it really is that as a writer, you actually develop a much deeper understanding of these inventions, and we understand them at an unconscious level at a way that consciously most of us as writers don't. And so basically things would just start popping up, things would happen, and then once that happened, once that scene is there, that opens up a whole other set of possibilities. I can't remember how it happened, but there's a running subplot and biblical references, and you heard that at the very beginning where Chandler refers to Adam. Well, that was there, and I didn't even know at the time there was going to be this running biblical theme, but that just kept coming up and coming up. So part of it was totally conscious, and part of it was just this absolutely magical thing that happens when you write fiction.
Mm. Well, we are almost out of time. Do you have any final words you'd like to tell our listeners? Anything about being a writer?
Well, if you have any aspirations, just do it. Just start writing a bit every day. It is, for me anyway, it is so much fun. I've just finished writing the sequel, which I hope will be coming out in a year. That's the way these things work, and it's I hope that readers will have fun reading it. That will feel challenged. Will be thinking about things and having discussions and arguments with other folks about it. But ultimately, just have fun escaping into this fictional world, this near future universe. But that's very much like our present. And just enjoy reading it. And let me know if you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Monica, lovely questions and thoughtful questions. I really appreciate your show and the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for that. And we usually close with a quote, and I found one from Sitting Bull. Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children.
Beautiful.
See you all next week on Writers' Voices.